Begin my time, I would first like to start by thanking my partner, my opponents, the judge, the audience, everybody here for making this debate possible. I'm sure it's going to be extremely fun. Now, I'm going to give a brief roadmap of what I'm going to do in this speech, which is essentially to affirm the resolution, propose a weighing mechanism of net benefits, and to go on to our case. So we are going to propose the weighing mechanism of net benefits as we are talking here about whether or not the benefits outweigh the drawbacks of this, of the TPP. So we are here to affirm the resolution that indeed the drawbacks of this plan are they significantly outweigh the benefits of it. And our first contention, or the first reason to affirm this, is the fact that the TPP is extremely paradoxical. So our uniqueness is that the TPP is basically a trade agreement that puts a lot of laws on international trade, and this extends to intellectual property, otherwise known as IP laws. So this treaty, as we know it, there's been a lot of news about leaks of this treaty and this has become an extremely big deal because of the fact that it's not transparent. And when these leaks were made, it was actually found out by many concerned citizens that the huge problem with this is the fact that the TPP is going to put restrictions on intellectual property laws that actually are going to lead to the abridging of freedom of speech. So the link is that when the freedom of speech is infringed upon, this not only violates a right that we have as U.S. citizens in our Constitution, but the UN Declaration of Human Rights states that as humans we have. So this infringes upon a basic human right, and the negative drawbacks of this are that when there are restrictions, especially placed on the people by the government regarding freedom of speech, these restrictions they become oppressive, and as a result, freedom of speech can be violated, and it manifests itself in lower innovation because if freedom of speech is protected, we can say whatever we want to, we can share our ideas openly, and if they go against this agreement, and if they don't get shared from certain people to other people who could possibly enact such innovations, especially technological ones, we're going to see an extreme decrease in the technological advances that are made, simply because the ideas are not going to be transported as easily because of these types of laws. And so when we see this lower innovation, these technological advances that we need to have happen, we're going to see also a decrease in STEM jobs, which in the status quo are the rates of STEM jobs are extremely dismal compared to what we need to have for our future. And as we're moving to a more technological future, abridging the freedom of speech, especially when it comes to intellectual property laws, is going to lead to just an extreme stalling of any kind of technological advances in STEM jobs that could really help us in the future. So we are not investing in our future by affirming a plan like this. Our second contention being that of being counterproductive and non-uniform. So our uniqueness is that the TPP allows for hefty fines for oversharing information, but these laws only apply to certain countries within this union. So those in the United States and Australia, sharing between the U.S. and Australia, for example, those have way heftier fines than do other countries in the union. For example, Finland doesn't have these types of restrictions placed on it, and so the laws are actually more flexible in a lot of places. So it's a non-uniform agreement. I'll take this after I get done with this subpoint. Basically, when these laws, because they are so flexible and so non-uniform, what we have is an agreement that we know is going to be flawed and faulty. We also know that when an agreement is non-uniform, it leads to less accountability because there is less equality. So you can't judge people on the same standard. And by affirming a plan like this, we are only going backwards when it comes to technological advances, when it comes to trade, when it comes to intellectual property, and most importantly, freedom of speech. Because as Americans, this is kind of a right that we've had, but people before us haven't had this right. They have worked for us to be able to have this right. And what this essentially does is put so much restrictions on what can be shared when it comes to intellectual property and computers that we are going to see just a large decrease of this kind of intellectual sharing as a result. And when we see this decrease, as we've stated, it's going to lead to a much less kind of diverse community of ideas out there. And this is something that we can't have. It's something that our society will actually become significantly worse when freedom of speech is abridged. So it's entirely unconstitutional. And because this is kind of the framework that our country runs off of, if we don't go by this framework, if we kind of decide to ignore parts of it and keep with others, what's going to happen is that our entire legal framework, as we know it, is going to be turned over on its head because of the fact that this main right that we have is just going to be taken away. So. We must also say, like, as an impact, that our society as a whole cannot have this trade agreement because of the fact not only that it abridges freedom of speech to such a degree, but that it places so many restrictions that personal freedoms are essentially going to be gone. And the impact of this is that when there are no freedoms, governments can become more totalitarian, and bad things happen in totalitarian governments. And this is something that, of course, would cause us to digress, would cause our society to kind of go back, and we would lose all the progress that we have made. And so for these reasons, I strongly urge you to vote in affirmation of this resolution. Okay.
So just as a roadmap, I'm going to go on case in order, so there are contentions in order, and I'm going to present one disadvantage. All right, so as the negation, I stand here to explain why the TPP has more benefits than it does disadvantages. So first, as I explained, I'm going to go ahead and refute why the affirmation has no real impacts and why the case doesn't exactly make sense, and then go on to talk about disadvantages. So their first main point here is that the TPP restricts intel sharing, that there's an abridgment on freedom of speech, and the thing is, they don't exactly provide a clear reason as to why this is. They just kind of make the assumption that because there are more laws in place, that suddenly, poof, out of nowhere, we're going to have more restrictions. And first of all, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is actually to some extent going to open up restrictions. We're going to have more free trade agreements. We're going to have more open relations between nations. So I really don't see where their first point is coming from about how restrictions are going to magically appear out of nowhere. So I don't think you should trust, Judge, that their entire case here that is solely based on the idea of restrictions and the freedom of speech abridgments makes any real sense in the context of the debate. So the only main links that they provided here is that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the First Amendment both provide the right to free speech. And here we say two things. First of all, the UDHR is not a mandatory document. It's not holding anyone to anything. The United States hasn't even signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So there isn't really any reason why we need to care about it. And plenty of countries, specifically countries including China, haven't even passed the UDHR either. So we should take that out of the debate entirely. Their entire link regarding that point makes no sense in the context of the debate. Furthermore, the United States Constitution only, once again, applies to the United States, as it is called so. So we can't really take freedom of speech points and apply them to everyone in the TPP, which includes around 20 different countries, and make sure that they apply their rules to fit ours. We can't just force our freedom of speech requirements upon them because their systems work differently. We can't assume that they value the same things we do. Finally, they somehow get to the fact that ideas being spread around, the lack of that leads to less STEM jobs, and then therefore people are going to have less STEM jobs in their country. But there's no link chain for that. We don't see how people in their own countries can't make their own ideas and can't have their own technology being passed around. We see that today. In the status quo, we see China's technology skyrocketing. We see some of the best technology, both at the military phase and space exploration phase, coming out of China. We see Russia with amazing space exploration programs. We see the United States with the best military in the world. We see all of these STEM jobs. We see all this research, and the TPP isn't even in place yet. So there's no reason why STEM jobs will go down if the TPP is suddenly enacted. So finally, they have no impact for this advantage. They say nothing about why a lack of STEM jobs is a bad idea, and so there isn't really any there isn't any impact to this contention. So their second advantage regards restrictions once again, and I kind of want to cross-apply what I've said to their earlier advantage to this point. So they say that restrictions are suddenly going to appear with the passing of the TPP, which is obviously a bad thing, but they never say where these restrictions are coming from. Well, as I've said before, the TPP is kind of a analogy to NAFTA. It opens up trade barriers and ensures that trading is more accommodable and easier for smaller nations that kind of thrive under China. So restrictions aren't going to appear out of nowhere. Furthermore, they say that faulty restrictions, non-uniform restrictions are less trustable. But once again, we don't see where these restrictions are coming from, so we can't trust them on that point. Finally, they link this less trustworthy restriction to, once again, less technological advances, and they don't provide any link as to how this is going to happen. They don't say that less uniform rules are suddenly going to lead to a plummet of technology. So on the negation side, we'd like to challenge the affirmation to provide us with examples of this so that we can even consider this as a factor into debate. They have no link in this argument. They don't show us how any of this actually happens, and their impacts are pretty straightforward. They say that suddenly we're going to have freedom of speech abridgments, which is, first of all, not terminal. I mean, freedom of speech is already being abridged all around the world. This is a non-unique point. We see so many countries around the world abridging the freedom of speech. This isn't going to solve freedom of speech. The TPP isn't going to just cause so much freedom of speech abridgments that it's suddenly a problem. We already have a problem in our world, and there's no reason why this would be any worse. So finally, their impact being less freedoms of speech is once again really a United States problem, because they never tell us why the U.S. is going to have less freedom of speech, and they never say how this links to the First Amendment. So we can't really figure out why countries in the South China Sea are going to have freedom of speech abridgments. They don't tell us any of that. So now we're going to talk about the benefits of the TPP, which are very, very strong. So right now, the United States is growing as a hegemon, and the tensions between the United States and China are increasing. And China is a great hegemon in Nigeria. They're trying to exert their power, and it's getting pretty intense. The United States and China are getting really, really worked up, trying to beat themselves at everything. So if we implement if we affirm, or if we negate that there are less benefits in passing the TPP than there are consequences, then what we're seeing is that there's more United States presence in the South China Sea, which means that the United States and China are going to have to get used to each other. They're going to be in more situations together. They're going to be working together to try to establish a secure economic piece of legislation. So what we see is that because the United States and China are suddenly two great economic superpowers put together to try to work out their differences, to try to manage their whole region encompassed under the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we can see that China will be more likely to work with the United States in the future because a lot of their economic relationships are so intertwined, and there are so many restrictions lifted that we will see that China will in fact appreciate the United States, and the United States and China will have better relations in the future. So the impacts of this are quite clear. First of all, without something like this Trans-Pacific Partnership, we see that the United States and China just get themselves worked up, try to dominate the world, try to take over, and it's very, very possible that there will be a United States-China war. They are both incredibly powerful countries, the best two militaries in the world, and they have nuclear weapons. So if in fact we don't pass the TPP, we will see that the United States and China will get into war very, very quickly because their relations are not going well at this point. So we could see a situation where nuclear war erupts and blow up enough dust to block out the sun and cause extinction, which is definitely a problem. So that's why the negation solves this quite clearly by forcing the United States and China to work out their differences in a place that's less violent and militarily based, which is the economy. So our impacts are quite powerful because we prevent extinction by passing the TPP. The TPP will prevent the entire world from getting involved in a nuclear war that we don't need to get involved in. On the app side, we see no negative impacts. We see a little bit of the freedom of speech being abridged. They don't tell us where and they don't tell us how it will happen. And furthermore, we see that somehow STEM jobs will decrease, which again has absolutely no impact in the app world. So for all of those reasons, I urge a strong vote in the negation. Thank you.
Okay, so say the word together. This contradicts that. But this contradicts. Okay, so.
So for a brief roadmap of my speech, I'm going to first address advantage number 1, advantage number 2, disadvantage number 1. So moving on to advantage number 1. So our opponents have clearly had some, don't understand how the implementation of the TPP will cause the infringement of freedom of speech, and how they seem to think that because other countries don't have it, it's okay for America to not implement, to forget the freedom of speech too. And so this decreases the freedom of speech because it decreases the trade between different countries and puts regulations on it. And by doing so, it stops the spread of ideas and is not good for the relationships of different countries by economy. And they enforce rules about trading plus sharing and government regulations. Also, the freedom of speech is, if we infringe on the freedom of speech, it is equal to a more totalitarian government, which has caused more deaths than all the wars combined. And just because we use the Declaration of Human Rights for the freedom of speech contention doesn't mean that America can still go. Just because they haven't signed it doesn't mean America can infringe on the freedom of speech. And yes.
So can you confirm your link chain is TPP to no freedom of speech to totalitarianism?
Okay, so first of all, TPP will set really many regulations, and this will cause the stop of the flow of ideas and spread of ideas throughout the economy and different countries, which will lead to, because of this, will lead to a more totalitarian government. And now I'll go on, and it's also, they have stated that that because less ideas are spread, and since many products come from China and other countries, this will be a very detriment to our economy, and as a result of this, there are less ideas, which won't be for employment and for more STEM jobs, and just less advancement technologically. And I'll move on to my second contention, which is that it's counterproductive. And so it's counterproductive because it puts more restrictions and prevents the relationships of economy of different countries by economy and trade. And I'll move on to their disadvantage. Number 1, they say that the United States will grow more in their presence will increase in the South China Sea, and they will somehow after implementing this TPP, then this will force America and China to work together. But ever since America's first presence in the South China Sea, Chinese military officials were not happy, and they told America to leave immediately. So this just explains how this will not work out. And just because we will have increased presence does not mean China will appreciate it. And now moving on to the fact that their impact to this if we implement the TPP, and the consequences of it is that it will lead to a nuclear war. But that is, on the impact calculus, a very improbable thing to happen, because China, with its 1.5 billion or so people, will not launch nuclear weapons, knowing that the threat of its civilians are in danger because of this. And mutually assured destruction will just prevent this from happening. And they said China and USA will work together, but this contradicts that. And how it is forcing the United States and America to work together is not a clear point and shouldn't flow through, because of the fact that China was not appreciative of America's presence in the South China Sea. And thank you, and please support the negation. Affirmation.
It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. So they have 8 minutes, then 4 minutes. Okay.
Are you guys ready?
Yes.
Awesome. So just off time, I'm going to talk about the negations, single contention, and then just move on to my opponent's contentions in order. Awesome. So the uniqueness for the negations first contention is pretty simple. Just in the case that the U.S. and China are, both becoming more of a presence in the South China Sea, and China is starting to expand its way into Nigeria. And also we're pointing out that the addition of the TPP will force some cooperation with the two countries. Now, my opponent came up here and said that whenever there's a military presence, China tends to get mad and then retaliate. But we'd like to point out that we're not claiming that the TPP will pose any military presence at all. I think that we both know that we're not promoting anything to do with military presence. Just the opposite. The TPP is merely to do with trade between the U.S. and China and multitude of other countries in Asia. So there's actually no reason that China would become more threatened by the U.S. because they're actually just going to be working together more closely. Also, my opponent claimed that on the impact level, this would be not probable for a number of reasons, including but not limited to mutual assured destruction. Now, I want to point out a couple of recent events. Xi Jinping is not only threatening, but actually taking arms up and buying countries in the South China Sea, stocking up on land and bases. And what this shows is that they're willing to invest into islands where U.S. arms are to pose more of a threat against the U.S. This is a war, or this is a battle for hegemony, in which the U.S. and China are edging their bets for. And what the TPP will do is that it will force cooperation between the two countries. It'll show them that they actually both have their best interest, because China and the U.S. are unique in the sense that while they might seem like odd business partners, they've been quite effective in the sense that China can, pose a lot of quantity, and the U.S. can work on their STEM jobs. And I'm going to talk about how this TPP will actually benefit the STEM jobs and turn my opponent's case in a few minutes. But first of all, I just want to clarify that since China has made advancements in terms of buying islands and arming islands and forces close to the U.S., this contention does remain probable, the impact should remain probable. So now I'm going to move on to my opponent's first contention, and I want to first talk about their big jumps in links. They essentially stated that the TPP will somehow boost a lot of restrictions, which will hinder freedom of speech, thus causing a totalitarian government. And there's problems with this all along the way. So with any free trade agreement, there is going to be restriction, because you can't just do anything you want, but also the free trade agreement that does pose ability to trade more freely as well. it's going to pose an easier avenue for the U.S. to trade with China and other countries. So, and also on top of this, any restrictions that do occur will not be based on matters of free speech. It'll be legal restrictions, it'll be border restrictions, but nothing to do with free speech. There's nothing in the TPP that says, oh, individuals can't say this one thing about whatever they're trading. It's not like the things that are going to be traded as a result of the TPP will be somewhat contentious toward matters of free speech. It's not like you can't talk about an iPhone or like a tomato, things that would be traded. Also, among freedom of speech, as my partner mentioned, freedom of speech is in the U.S. Constitution, not the Chinese. So you can't violate, or you can't abridge freedom of speech in a government where freedom of speech is not in its constitution. So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Also, there is freedom of speech restrictions in China right now. In fact, I just got back from there last week, and we could not say anything bad about Deng Xiaoping or Mao Zedong in front of an official, and simple searches were blocked, like Google, etc. However, that doesn't mean that China was all hindered economically or became some totalitarian government. China still has the largest government, or has the largest gross domestic product in the world, and whatever they're doing is actually serving them quite well. Also, we can see there's a bunch of countries that don't have as much protections on freedom of speech as the U.S. That doesn't mean that there's a bunch of totalitarian governments in the world. Totalitarian goes above and beyond freedom of speech. Totalitarian means, means much more than just freedom of speech. So just because, even if you do buy that there would be freedom of speech restrictions, the impacts would still be non-existent because that is not at all linked to said totalitarian government. Also, I want to move to their point about STEM government, about STEM jobs. If anything, the TPP will boost STEM jobs. It has been widely known that trade throughout countries actually increases STEM jobs and just jobs in general, because before there was international trade, etc., countries were confined to their own homeland where they had limited resources, limited outreach abilities, but with increased trade with countries, you can get the best of both worlds for two countries. So China can produce their products in mass factories, while the U.S. can spend more time designing their STEM jobs, which is the best of both worlds from China and the U.S. Also, you have to design trade routes, etc. So if anything, this will increase STEM jobs. And next, I want to move on to the affirmation's second contention. They never brought up our points, drawing correlations to NAFTA and its lack of restrictions. Also, they never brought up points regarding their lack of uniqueness here, regarding freedom of speech again, and also tech jobs. So our point about NAFTA here was that the restrictions will not be as abundant as my opponents are saying, similar to the way that NAFTA didn't increase restrictions. It actually decreased restrictions and allowed for increased trade. As for their point about freedom of speech, again, in their second contention, not only was that very similar to the first contention, which was confusing for me, but also it was non-unique. They didn't explain how we needed to protect freedom of speech, etc., because there were no impacts to that. So for the reasons that my opponents make big link jumps from the TPP to a lack of freedom of speech to totalitarian government, and also whatever impacts they do seem to have, such as freedom of speech, don't really have big impacts to them, I would urge a strong vote in the negation, because we do pose a big and terminal impact, being the accelerating conflicts between the U.S. and China, and the very probable occasion of a nuclear war between these two countries if we don't pass the TPP, because the TPP will force the cooperation that's necessary to create diplomatic relationships between the two countries. So for the reasons, I urge a vote in the affirmation. Thank you. Or in the negation.
Okay, so as a quick roadmap, I'm going to go impact calculus and then weighing mechanism. All right, right, so in these last 4 minutes of the negation side of the speech, I'm going to convince you, Judge, that we have won the debate. So let's take a look at impact calculus. So the only impacts, the only negative consequences that the affirmation has proposed is that, first of all, we'll get a lack of freedom of speech. Somehow, the negation doesn't really buy this, but if a lack of freedom of speech will suddenly lead to totalitarianism, which will somehow create more deaths than wars, all the wars combined. However, there is no link. The probability of this happening is extremely, extremely low, so you should not buy this argument because the affirmation has failed to provide any evidence as to how this has happened. They have provided us with no historical examples as to why this works. And finally, their link to the lack of freedom of speech is incredibly, incredibly weak, almost non-existent. So you cannot buy this argument. The argument that they propose in both their first and second contentions, which we can group together as one main freedom of speech argument, doesn't really have a link, doesn't really have an impact, and whatever impacts they do propose are very low in probability. Let's look at our contention. In the neg world, we see that we prevent a nuclear war. As my partner has said, China has threatened the United States. It has made threats in the past couple of weeks. It is prepared. It is very ready to launch a nuclear war against the United States. They don't care about mutual assured destruction. They don't care about that. They see themselves losing their position as a world hegemon to the United States, and that's all that matters at this point. So you see that nuclear war has a high probability given the resolution of the TPP. You see that China has already made threats, and they're very prepared. You see a high magnitude consequence as well. You see that that it will result in enough dust being kicked up to block out the sun. You will see that the entire world would get involved as the two of the largest superpowers in the world engage in nuclear war. It is a very dangerous thing. And finally, there's a low time frame. It could happen any day now. China is ready. The United States is ready to retaliate. There is no reason why we can't have a nuclear war in the very, very near future. Now let's look at the weighing mechanism. So if we're to look at net benefits, we can see that we obviously have, the negation has won this too. We see that the possibility of nuclear war has been completely averted, with the United States and China being forced to work together in the same environment and develop economic relations. Their only refutation to this point was that China is very upset with the United States for sending in military forces into their general territory. But the thing is, this is economic diplomacy. This is, in fact, making the barriers between China and the United States less, not increasing them. This has nothing to do with the military at this point. So their refutations at this point don't make sense. So if we look at the weighing mechanism once again, we can see that we've averted a nuclear war. What they've done is they've promoted the freedom of speech. That's what they're doing. They're promoting the freedom of speech. But this argument, as my partner said, is completely non-unique. We see freedom of speech abridgments today in the world, and it's not like the TPP is suddenly going to cause them to skyrocket significantly more than they are now, even if they do at all. So if you look at things in the grand scheme, you see that a drawback from the TPP is maybe restrictions that somehow appear will cause people's freedom of speech to be abridged. But in the neg world, you will see a nuclear war averted. You will see millions, if not billions, of people not perishing. You will see the two largest powers in the world not going to war against each other. And this significantly outweighs whatever the affirmation has offered you throughout this debate. So because of the reasons that the affirmation provides you no impact, and whatever impacts they do hope to achieve have no probability of happening, as well as no link of actually getting there, and the negation has averted nuclear war and prevented the deaths of billions, I urge a strong vote in the negation. Thank you.
So, Judge, today I'm going to convince you that indeed the TPP has more drawbacks than it does have benefits, and I will also convince you that to vote for the affirmation. And I'm going to go into this, and I'm going to go into this in the form of going over some points that have been ongoing in this debate and calculating the impacts. So, the negations case is essentially based off of one contention that is founded in the idea that we must reach the only reason to pass this is to reach a deal with China, because so that we can avoid this nuclear war that essentially is not going to happen. In fact, they have provided absolutely no links about how the reason that China would declare nuclear war on us would be solved by this TTP, especially because they said that in the last couple of days and weeks there have been nuclear war threats. These threats are something that could happen at any day, and this agreement will not be passed at any day. So even if it were true that this agreement would stop nuclear war from happening, this should not flow through because the effects of this would not even be seen in their world. So there's another point in this debate that has been ongoing about whether or not this nuclear war is going to happen for a various amount of reasons. So we'd like to state that even if U.S. hegemony or China hegemony would be impacted by this agreement, we'd like to say that the sheer amount of negative history that we have with China would not be solved by one trade agreement, especially when there is so much bad blood between us and so much bad history that if China were to, for example, declare nuclear war, which, as we stated, is extremely unlikely, even if this were to happen, there are so many things working against the fact that we would work together because of an agreement that this simply should not. This is not an argument that should flow through. Next, on the point of STEM jobs, this has been another huge issue in the debate. They stated that, if anything, the STEM jobs are going to be increased by this because of the manufacturing and the trade routes. However, while we might see a temporary grow in these STEM jobs on the affirmation side with this treaty being passed, we are going to see long-term that these STEM jobs are going to fizzle out because the trade of ideas is going to be so abridged that bad things are going to happen in terms of technological advances. They also stated that there's also ongoing stuff about like the freedom of speech and that abridging freedom of speech doesn't cause totalitarianism. However, we would like to state that, and they also say that China is a totalitarian government, so freedom of speech doesn't matter already. It's already being abridged. However, this actually proves our case because we can see that freedom of speech leads directly into a government that is extremely controlling of its citizens, and you see all these negative impacts. They also stated that mutually assured destruction is not going to be something that should even be a voting issue, that should even be an issue in this debate, because they use the warrant of current events, and that being weapons being brought over. However, we'd like to state that weapons being transported from one area to another is not the same as launching nuclear bombs that would cause so much dust that they would block out the sun, therefore cause extinction. So this should not flow through either. So, Judge, the reason why you should vote for the affirmation is because we've clearly shown that there are terrible things that can come with the abridging of freedom of speech. And while it isn't considered a human right in several countries, this does not mean that the lack of freedom of speech is going to. This doesn't mean that the lack of freedom of speech is not going to cause terrible things from happening. We are much more likely to die under the regime of a totalitarian government than of a nuclear war that could potentially, that the affirmation stated would happen imminently if this agreement were not passed. And so basically the impacts of this are that in the affirmations world, what we have is, if this were passed, is that we would have these stunted technological developments in a much more unstable government than we would otherwise see in the negations world. If this resolution were negated and this plan indeed were passed, what we would see is essentially that all of these terrible kind of stalling of the advances in technology, the lack of freedom of speech is going to mean that our society is going to be perpetually stuck in the past. And for all of these reasons, I strongly urge you to vote in affirmation of this resolution. Thank you.